Hey guys, medieval drinking water sounds like a simple problem at first. People were thirsty, rivers were nearby, wells were common, and rain fell just as it does now. But the strange truth is that water in the Middle Ages was not just something people drank. It was a gamble with mud, animals, human waste, bad engineering, religious habit, town politics, and invisible dangers no one could yet understand. Before we settle into that world, tell me where you're watching from and what history topic you'd like us to explore next. If you enjoy thoughtful long-form history like this, a like is a simple way to support it. And if calm, quietly fascinating stories from the past are your kind of evening, subscribing will bring more of them your way. So let's begin not with a castle or a battlefield or a king, but with a cup of water. Imagine a small medieval town just before sunrise. The streets are narrow, uneven, and still dark in the corners where the morning light has not yet reached. Roofs lean over the lanes. Smoke hangs low from hearths that have burned through the night. Somewhere nearby, a rooster calls, a cartwheel creaks, and a woman steps out carrying a wooden bucket, because before bread can be baked, before animals can be fed, before children can be washed, the household needs water. To us, water seems like the most basic promise of daily life. We turn a tap, and the trust is almost automatic. But in medieval Europe, water was never quite so simple. It came from wells, streams, ponds, rain barrels, cisterns, rivers, springs, and sometimes from public conduits built at great expense. Each source had its own reputation. Each had its own risks, and almost none of those risks were understood in the way we understand them today. This is important because the old popular story is often too simple. It says medieval people drank beer because the water was always deadly. That version is memorable, but it is not quite true. Many medieval people did drink water. Some water was considered clean. Some springs were valued for freshness. Some wells were carefully protected. Monasteries, towns, and castles could invest heavily in water supply. But the deeper truth is more interesting than the myth. Medieval people lived in a world where water could be familiar, necessary, useful, even trusted, and still be dangerous in ways they could not see. The danger was not only that people were careless. It was that their entire environment worked against them. A village well might stand near cottages, gardens, pigsties, manure heaps, and burial grounds. A town stream might carry rainwater, kitchen scraps, dye from workshops, blood from butchers, waste from animals, and whatever had been thrown into the street the night before. A river might look clean where it flowed past the wall, while just upstream someone was washing cloth, soaking hides, emptying refuse, or letting livestock drink from the bank. The water was part of the same world as everything else. It had no sealed pipe to protect it from daily life. And daily life was messy. In a medieval town, waste did not vanish. It accumulated, seeped, flowed, and settled. People threw household scraps into yards or streets. Animals lived close to humans. Horses, pigs, chickens, dogs, and cattle moved through the same spaces where people walked. Rain could wash filth downhill into gutters, ditches, ponds, and wells. In dry weather, waste could sit in the street until it was trampled into the ground. In wet weather, it could become part of the water system. To the medieval eye, the clearest warning sign was not bacteria because bacteria were unknown. The warning signs were smell, taste, color, movement, and reputation. Running water was often thought better than standing water. Clear water seemed safer than cloudy water. A foul smell could make a source suspicious. A spring with cold, lively water might be prized. A stagnant pond, green and still, could be distrusted. These judgments were not foolish. They were practical observations. But they could only go so far. The most dangerous water could still look innocent. This is where the medieval world becomes especially uncomfortable. People were not living in ignorance because they lacked intelligence. They were living before germ theory, before modern sanitation, before chemical testing, before municipal purification, before the ordinary invisible safety net that surrounds water in many places today. They knew water could be bad. They knew foul conditions could bring sickness. They understood corruption, miasma, stench, rot, imbalance, and impurity in ways shaped by their own medicine and theology. But they did not know that a clear cup could carry organisms capable of causing diarrhea, dysentery, typhoid-like fevers, parasites, and outbreaks that moved through families before anyone understood the chain. The risk was not dramatic every time someone drank. It was quieter than that. It was repeated exposure. A cup drawn from a questionable source. A child drinking from a ditch. A traveler trusting the wrong stream. A servant filling a bucket after heavy rain. A town well contaminated from below by seepage no one could see. For the poor, the danger was often greater because safety required time, access, labor, and sometimes money. A wealthy household might have servants to fetch water from a better source. A monastery might have channels, drains, fish ponds, and careful rules. A castle might be built around a protected well or cistern, because without water a fortress could not survive a siege. But a cramped urban household might depend on a public well shared by many neighbors, surrounded by the pressures of crowding, trade, animals, and waste. Water reveals the hidden structure of medieval society. It shows who had space, who had labor, who had rights, who had protection, and who had to accept what was nearest. In rural places, the picture was not always worse. A small settlement near a clean spring might have better everyday water than a crowded town. But rural life had its own dangers. Wells could be shallow. Animals could contaminate streams. Fields were fertilized with manure. Flooding could mix everything together. Seasonal changes mattered. A source that seemed reliable in winter could become low and foul in summer. A stream after rain could carry whatever the landscape had loosened. And because water was heavy, people did not casually travel far for it if they had a closer option. One bucket might weigh enough to make every extra step meaningful. The practical question was not, where is the cleanest water in theory? It was, where can this household get enough water today, before the work of the day begins? That difference matters. A medieval family needed water for drinking, cooking, brewing, washing, soaking, cleaning tools, tending animals, making bread, preparing pottage, laundering cloth, and sometimes for small crafts carried out at home. The amount required could be enormous relative to the labor available. Fetching water was not a charming domestic detail. It was repetitive physical work. It shaped mornings. It shaped children's chores. It shaped women's labor in many households. It shaped where homes were built and how towns developed. A well was not just infrastructure. It was a social center, a labor site, a source of gossip, a point of conflict, and sometimes a place of regulation. Towns tried to manage water, though never with the consistency of a modern system. Some authorities issued rules against dumping waste near wells or fouling streams. Some protected conduits. Some fined people for washing dirty materials in drinking water sources. These rules tell us something important. Medieval people recognized contamination as a problem. They did not need microscopes to know that a butcher's waste in a stream was bad for the community. They did not need modern chemistry to understand that certain trades polluted water. But rules are one thing. Enforcement is another. A town could forbid dumping, but if streets were crowded, drains poor, animals everywhere, and trades packed tightly along waterways, pollution still happened. A tannery needed water. A dyer needed water. A brewer needed water. A butcher needed a place to wash. Mills needed rivers. Households needed disposal. The same waterways that sustained economic life also received its waste. This is one of the quiet contradictions of medieval water. The more active and prosperous a town became, the more pressure it placed on the very sources that kept it alive. London, Paris, York, Florence, Cologne, and countless smaller towns all had to solve some version of the same problem. How do you bring water in, move waste out, support trade, and keep people from poisoning the shared supply when the science of disease is incomplete and the tools of urban management are limited? The answer was never one perfect system. It was a patchwork. Some places developed conduits that carried water from springs outside the town. These could be impressive works of planning and investment. Public fountains or conduit heads became valuable urban features. Access to them could be controlled, contested, and celebrated. Wealthy donors sometimes funded waterworks as acts of piety and public service, because providing water had moral weight. Clean water was not only useful, it was charitable, it was civic, could be spiritually meaningful. But even conduits required maintenance. Pipes could break, channels could leak, unauthorized users could tap into supplies. Water could be diverted. The system could favor some neighborhoods over others. And once the water reached a crowded town, it still had to be carried, stored, and protected inside homes. Storage created another risk. A bucket, barrel, jug, or cistern could keep water close at hand, but it could also become dirty. Hands dipped in, cups touched mouths, dust settled, insects found openings. Wooden vessels absorbed smells and residues. If water was kept too long, its freshness faded. The household container became the final stage of the water journey, and it mattered as much as the well. For medieval people, freshness was a prized quality. Cold spring water, newly drawn, could be admired. Water that had stood too long might be avoided. Medical writers sometimes advised caution about marshy water, stagnant water, or water from certain soils. They debated the qualities of waters according to place, season, temperature, and effect on the body. Their explanations were not modern, but they were not random. They were attempts to make sense of patterns. A person might notice that one well caused stomach troubles more often than another. A traveler might learn that locals avoided a certain pond. A monastery might protect an upstream supply with practical seriousness. Experience mattered. Memory mattered. Reputation mattered. Yet experience was fragile. A source could be clean one month and contaminated the next. A storm could change everything. A dead animal upstream could go unnoticed. A latrine too near a well could slowly leak into the groundwater. A growing town could overwhelm older arrangements. What had once been safe enough could become risky under new pressure. And then there was the problem of taste. Modern people sometimes imagine that medieval people avoided water entirely and drank ale or wine all day. The truth is more varied. In many regions, weak ale, small beer, cider, wine, or watered wine did form part of daily consumption. Depending on region, class, age, and availability, brewing could make a beverage safer in some cases because boiling and fermentation reduced certain dangers. But that does not mean every drink was alcoholic in the modern sense, or that people were constantly drunk, or that water was never consumed. Small beer or weak ale could be low in alcohol and consumed with meals. In wine-growing regions, diluted wine was common. In some monastic and urban contexts, drink allowances were part of daily routine. But water remained essential. It was used in cooking, in brewing itself, in cleaning, in medicine, and in ordinary thirst. Even when people drank ale, the ale began with water. So the real question is not, did medieval people drink water or alcohol? The better question is, how did people manage risk in a world where every drink depended on local conditions? That question opens the door to a more human history. Think of a child in a village, sent with a smaller pail to fetch water from a nearby stream. Think of a servant in a city household joining a queue at a public conduit. Think of a monk walking through a cloister where water channels have been carefully arranged for washing, cooking, gardens, and latrines. Think of a castle garrison during a siege, knowing that the wall is only as strong as the water supply inside it. Think of a traveler arriving at an inn, tired and dusty, accepting whatever drink is offered because the road has made thirst stronger than caution. Water was never just water. It was geography, labor, class, engineering, health, religion, and survival gathered into one ordinary act. And because it was ordinary, it appears everywhere once we begin looking. In monasteries, water was tied to discipline and order. Many monastic communities placed great importance on cleanliness, ritual washing, and controlled daily routine. Some monasteries became remarkably sophisticated in managing water, using channels to bring supplies in and remove waste. Their systems were not modern plumbing, but they show a serious understanding that water had to be organized. The monastery was, in many ways, a model of controlled environment. Kitchens, infirmaries, gardens, mills, fish ponds, latrines, and washing spaces all connected to water in some way. But even there, the goal was not only health. It was order. Cleanliness had spiritual associations. Washing hands before meals, maintaining certain spaces, and managing waste all belonged to a wider rhythm of discipline. In this sense, medieval water belonged to both the body and the soul. In towns, the moral language could be just as strong. A polluted well was not merely inconvenient. It was a failure of neighborly conduct. Someone who fouled a shared source endangered others. Someone who maintained a conduit might be remembered as a benefactor. Water connected private behavior to public consequence. This is one of the reasons medieval records sometimes mention water disputes with surprising intensity. A blocked channel, a diverted stream, a damaged pipe, or a contaminated well could affect many households. The conflict might seem small on paper, but to the people involved it touched cooking, washing, animals, business, and health. In a world without instant replacement, a broken water source was an immediate crisis. The deeper we go, the clearer it becomes that medieval people did not live without water knowledge. They had water knowledge of a different kind. Local, sensory, inherited, practical, and moral. They knew which springs were praised, which ponds were avoided, which wells were old, which streams served which trades, which routes were easiest, and which sources tasted wrong after rain. But local knowledge could not fully protect them from invisible contamination. That is the tragic limitation at the center of the story. A person could do many things right and still get sick. They could choose running water over stagnant water. They could draw from a respected well. They could avoid foul smells. They could boil water in cooking. They could drink ale from a careful brewer. They could follow the habits of their elders. And still, in the right conditions, disease could pass through the household like a shadow. This made water a source of quiet uncertainty. Not constant terror, but uncertainty. Most days people drank and lived. Most cups did not lead to catastrophe. But the possibility was always woven into the background of life, especially in crowded places and during seasons of heat, flood, scarcity, or epidemic illness. And scarcity could make everything worse. When water was abundant, people could be choosier. When it was scarce, they might have to use what was available. A dry season could lower wells and concentrate filth. A frozen period could limit access. A siege could turn a protected cistern into the difference between endurance and surrender. A growing city could outpace its old supply. In these moments, the social order of water became visible. Who had priority? Who controlled access? Who paid? Who carried? Who waited? Even the architecture of medieval life tells this story. Wells in courtyards, cisterns in castles, conduits in market squares, channels near monasteries, latrines placed over rivers or pits, streets shaped by drainage or failing to drain at all. The built environment was an argument with water, an attempt to capture it, guide it, use it, and move it away before it turned dangerous. But medieval engineering was always fighting gravity, terrain, money, and habit. A town could build drains, but drains clogged. A castle could collect rainwater, but roofs gathered dirt and bird droppings. A household could store water, but storage vessels needed cleaning. A stream could carry waste away, but only by carrying it toward someone else. That last point is uncomfortable, because it reminds us that sanitation often depends on distance. If waste moved away from one neighborhood, it might become another neighborhood's problem. If a river carried refuse downstream, people upstream could imagine the problem solved. But water does not respect human convenience. It connects places that people prefer to separate. The medieval world understood this imperfectly but not entirely blindly. Many communities made rules about who could use certain water sources and how. Some trades were pushed to particular areas because of smell or pollution. Some wells were covered or protected. Some water carriers made a living by delivering supplies. Some households paid for better access. Practical solutions existed, but they were uneven. The unevenness is essential. There was no single medieval experience of drinking water. A noble household, a rural peasant family, a city apprentice, a nun in a well-managed convent, a sailor, a pilgrim, a prisoner, and a soldier in a besieged fortress all lived with water differently. For some, water was plentiful but laborious. For others, it was nearby but foul. For others, it was controlled by landlords or town officials. For others, it was part of a daily religious routine. For travelers, it could be unpredictable. For the sick, it could be medicine, comfort, or risk. Medical thinking shaped these choices too. Medieval physicians inherited and developed traditions from ancient Greek, Roman, Arabic, and Latin medical writing. They often understood health through balance, qualities, humors, air, diet, season, and environment. Water could be classified by its qualities: cold, warm, heavy, light, clear, marshy, mineral, rain-fed, spring-fed, riverine. Some waters were thought better for digestion. Others were suspected of causing swelling, fevers, or weakness. This was not modern epidemiology, but it was a serious attempt to connect environment and body. The danger came when a theory noticed real patterns but explained them incompletely. Bad smells often did accompany filth. Stagnant water often was risky. Marshy landscapes could indeed be associated with illness, but the invisible mechanisms remained hidden. So remedies and warnings sometimes helped, sometimes failed, and sometimes gave confidence where caution was still needed. There is a strange humility in studying this. It is easy for modern viewers to feel superior to people who did not know about germs. But medieval people also lived with practical knowledge we rarely consider: how water moved through soil, which spring tasted clean, how to draw from a well without muddying it, how to ration drink on a journey, how to judge the freshness of ale, how to manage animals near water, how to survive when the usual source failed. Their weakness was not stupidity. It was the boundary of their tools. And that boundary could be deadly. When waterborne illness struck, it did not announce itself as waterborne. It appeared as flux, fever, weakness, stomach pain, sudden decline, or a wasting sickness that might be blamed on bad air, spoiled food, divine punishment, imbalance, seasonal corruption, or the general unhealthiness of a place. Sometimes those explanations contained fragments of truth. Often they missed the path by which disease had entered the body. This meant prevention was inconsistent. People might avoid a foul ditch while continuing to trust a contaminated well. They might fear night air while drinking from a source affected by latrine seepage. They might pray, purge, change diet, burn herbs, or move away from a bad-smelling area, while the water continued its quiet work. And yet, despite all this, medieval life went on. People married, farmed, traded, brewed, cooked, raised children, built towns, founded monasteries, crossed seas, and made pilgrimage. They did not experience every drink as a crisis. Risk was normalized because it was embedded in everything. The modern feeling that water should be guaranteed safe would have seemed, to many of them, like an unimaginable luxury. Their world asked a different question each day. Not whether water could be made perfectly safe, but whether it could be made usable enough. That phrase, usable enough, may be the key to understanding medieval water. It was the standard by which much of life operated. Food was preserved enough. Streets were cleaned enough. Houses were heated enough. Wounds were treated enough. Water was protected enough until it was not. And when it was not, the consequences could ripple quietly through a household, then a street, then a town. This is why the history of medieval drinking water is really a history of thresholds. The threshold between clean and contaminated, between smell and invisibility, between local wisdom and scientific limit, between private habit and public health, between enough water and dangerous scarcity, between a town that grows and the systems that fail to grow with it. As we move deeper into this world, the next thing to understand is where the water actually came from, because every source carried a different kind of promise and a different kind of danger. As we move deeper into this world, the next thing to understand is where the water actually came from, because every source carried a different kind of promise and a different kind of danger. The most familiar source for many medieval people was the well. To modern eyes, a well often appears reassuring. A stone ring, a bucket, a rope, water drawn from underground rather than from a muddy stream. It feels protected, cleaner, more reliable. Sometimes it was. But a medieval well was only as safe as the land around it and the care taken to maintain it. Many wells were relatively shallow. They reached groundwater, but not necessarily water isolated from contamination. If waste pits, animal enclosures, latrines, or refuse heaps stood too close, rainwater could slowly carry pollutants downward through the soil. The process was invisible. A family might use the same well for years without understanding why illnesses seemed to come and go. In villages, this danger often developed gradually. A settlement that began as a handful of houses might expand over generations. New buildings appeared. More animals were kept nearby. More waste accumulated. What had once been a reasonably safe source could become increasingly vulnerable as population density grew. The change would rarely be obvious. The water might remain clear. It might still taste familiar. It might still be considered the village's trusted well. And that is one of the recurring themes of medieval water. Danger often arrived quietly. Town wells faced a different challenge. In crowded urban environments, the pressure on space was immense. Medieval towns were not designed around modern sanitation principles. Houses clustered tightly together. Workshops occupied valuable ground. Livestock shared urban spaces. Every available corner served some purpose. Finding a suitable place for a well was one challenge. Protecting it for decades was another. Municipal authorities sometimes recognized this problem. Records survive describing regulations intended to protect public water sources. Certain activities could be restricted near wells. Waste disposal might be regulated. Repairs might be ordered. But enforcement varied enormously. A growing commercial town was a noisy, crowded organism. Rules competed with economic necessity. If a craftsman needed water for his trade, he often found ways to obtain it. If waste needed disposal, convenience frequently won over ideal practice. The result was a constant tension between public need and private convenience. And nowhere was this tension more visible than around rivers. For many medieval communities, rivers were lifelines. They provided transport. They powered mills. They supported fishing. They supplied water. They carried waste away. And therein lay the problem. The same river could perform all of these functions simultaneously. Imagine standing beside a river flowing through a medieval town. Upstream, women wash clothing against stones. Nearby, horses enter the shallows to drink. A mill will turn steadily. A dyer rinses fabric. A butcher cleans equipment. Children play at the edge of the water. Fishermen prepare their catch. A household servant fills buckets for cooking. Each activity makes perfect sense on its own. Collectively, they create a complex system in which contamination becomes difficult to avoid. People often understood pieces of this reality. They recognized that some stretches of water were preferable to others. Certain towns attempted to separate activities. Specific riverbanks might be associated with particular trades. Authorities occasionally intervened when pollution became excessive. Yet rivers remained fundamentally shared spaces, and shared spaces rarely stay pristine for long. This is one reason why springs acquired such an important reputation. Across medieval Europe, natural springs often enjoyed special status. Some were valued for their taste, others for their reliability. Some became associated with healing. Others acquired religious significance. Cold spring water emerging directly from the earth possessed an appeal that was both practical and symbolic. It seemed fresh. It seemed pure. It seemed untouched by the corruption visible elsewhere. Of course, not every spring was actually safe by modern standards, but many genuinely offered better quality water than nearby alternatives. Communities sometimes went to remarkable lengths to protect them. Channels were constructed. Stone coverings were installed. Access was regulated. Pilgrims traveled significant distances to famous springs. Monasteries occasionally developed around reliable water sources. A spring could influence settlement patterns, economic activity, and local identity. In some regions, people spoke about particular springs almost as if they possessed personalities. One spring was known for sweetness, another for coldness, another for healing properties, another for reliability during drought. Water was never merely water. It carried stories, and stories often became part of how communities judged safety. If generations had trusted a spring, newcomers tended to trust it too. Sometimes that trust was justified. Sometimes it was not. But reputation mattered enormously in a world without laboratory testing. Another important source came from the sky itself. Rainwater collection was surprisingly common in certain contexts. Castles frequently depended upon it. Monasteries used it. Urban households sometimes collected it where practical. Cisterns allowed communities to store water for future use. At first glance, rainwater seems ideal. After all, it falls clean from the clouds. Yet medieval rainwater systems faced their own complications. Water rarely traveled directly into a container. It ran across roofs, passed through gutters, collected debris. Bird droppings accumulated. Leaves decayed. Dust settled. Storage introduced additional concerns. A cistern required maintenance. Sediment accumulated. Containers could become contaminated. Stagnation created problems. Nevertheless, rainwater remained valuable, especially where groundwater was limited or difficult to access. In fortified locations, it could become indispensable. Consider the reality of a siege. When modern audiences imagine medieval castles, they often focus on walls, towers, drawbridges, and soldiers. But military engineers worried about something more basic: water. A magnificent fortress with an inadequate water supply was fundamentally vulnerable. An attacking army might fail to breach the walls. It might fail to destroy the gates. Yet, if defenders exhausted their water reserves, the outcome could become inevitable. For this reason, many castles invested enormous effort in securing dependable supplies. Some possessed deep wells extending astonishing distances into the earth. Others maintained extensive cistern systems. Some combined multiple methods to improve resilience. Constructing these systems was expensive and difficult. Digging a deep well through rock required extraordinary labor. Workers risked injury and death. Projects could take years. Yet rulers considered the expense worthwhile because water meant survival. Even so, security was never guaranteed. Wells could fail. Supplies could become contaminated. Storage systems could be damaged. Nature remained unpredictable, and nature often had the final word. Seasonal change affected every water source. A spring that flowed generously in winter might weaken during summer. A river could shrink. Pond could stagnate. Heavy rain might temporarily improve supply while simultaneously increasing contamination risks. Floods created their own problems. Modern flood control systems did not exist. When rivers overflowed, they carried everything with them. Animal waste, human waste, refuse, dead livestock, debris from streets and fields. Floodwater connected environments that were normally separate. Once the water receded, contamination frequently remained behind. For communities dependent upon local sources, this could create lingering consequences. A well affected by flooding might continue to present risks long after the flood itself was forgotten. Yet, because contamination often remained invisible, cause and effect were difficult to identify. Someone might notice that illness became common after a flood. Another person might blame unusual weather. Another might suspect divine displeasure. Another might focus on foul air. Without microbiology, patterns could be recognized without being fully understood. This limitation appears repeatedly throughout medieval medical writing. Many physicians paid close attention to environment. They observed seasonal illness. They discussed the qualities of water. They warned against certain conditions. Some recommendations were surprisingly sensible. Others reflected theories we no longer accept. But underlying all of them was a genuine effort to understand why certain places seemed healthier than others. In fact, medieval medical thinkers often displayed remarkable observational discipline. They watched, they compared, they recorded, they searched for relationships between landscape and health. What they lacked was not curiosity. It was access to mechanisms hidden beyond the reach of contemporary science. That distinction matters because it helps us avoid a common misunderstanding. Medieval people were not passive victims wandering blindly through dangerous conditions. They actively managed risk. They discussed water quality. They preferred certain sources. They developed rules. They invested resources. They passed knowledge between generations. They adapted when circumstances changed. Their world contained uncertainty, but it also contained expertise. A village elder might know which stream remained reliable during drought. A monk responsible for infrastructure might understand drainage patterns intimately. A water carrier might know which sources produced the freshest supply. A brewer might recognize subtle differences between local waters. Knowledge existed. It was simply local rather than scientific in the modern sense. And local knowledge often worked surprisingly well. The difficulty came when conditions changed faster than tradition could adapt. A growing town provides an excellent example. Many medieval urban centers expanded dramatically during certain periods. Population increased. Trade intensified. Construction accelerated. Economic activity flourished. From a distance, growth looked like success. Yet success created new pressure on water systems. A well designed for hundreds might suddenly serve thousands. A stream once flowing past scattered houses now passed crowded workshops. Waste volumes increased. Animals multiplied. Industrial activities expanded. The water supply that had sustained one generation might struggle to sustain the next. This created a subtle historical irony. Prosperity often increased water-related challenges. The very developments that made towns wealthier could make their water more vulnerable. Urban authorities responded in various ways. Some invested in conduits bringing water from distant springs. Others improved drainage. Some attempted stricter regulation. Occasionally, impressive engineering projects emerged. These efforts remind us that medieval communities were not simply accepting poor conditions. They were constantly negotiating with them, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, and the negotiation extended beyond towns into the countryside. Because while urban water problems attract attention, most medieval people lived in rural environments. Their experiences could differ dramatically. A small farming community near a reliable spring might enjoy relatively good water. A remote hamlet might depend entirely on seasonal sources. An isolated farm could face challenges unknown to urban residents. Distance changed everything. If a well failed in a town, alternatives might exist. If a well failed in a remote settlement, the consequences could be much more serious. Daily routines adjusted accordingly. Water collection shaped the rhythm of life. Morning journeys became necessary. Storage became important. Knowledge of local geography became essential. Children learned routes. Families developed habits. Entire communities organized themselves around access. This practical reality often disappears from modern imagination. Today, water frequently arrives with minimal effort. Medieval people rarely enjoyed that luxury. Every bucket represented labor. Every full barrel represented planning. Every reliable source represented security. And because obtaining water demanded effort, decisions about its use mattered. People thought carefully about which water was suitable for drinking, cooking, brewing, washing, animals, or craft work. Different sources could serve different purposes. A household might reserve its best water for consumption while using lower-quality supplies elsewhere. Such decisions reveal a world of constant resource management. Nothing was entirely taken for granted. And perhaps nowhere was that more evident than in the relationship between water and brewing, because the story of medieval ale turns out to be far more complicated than the familiar modern myth suggests. For many people, brewing was not merely an alternative to water. It was deeply connected to the water supply itself, and understanding that connection begins with the surprisingly complex journey from the well to the brewing vat. For many people, brewing was not merely an alternative to water. It was deeply connected to the water supply itself, and understanding that connection begins with the surprisingly complex journey from the well to the brewing vat. The familiar modern image of medieval Europe often includes tankards of ale sitting on rough wooden tables, accompanied by the claim that people drank beer because water was unsafe. Like many popular historical ideas, this contains a grain of truth wrapped inside a much simpler story. The reality was more nuanced, and in many ways more revealing. To begin with, brewing itself required water. Large amounts of it. Whether a household was making a small batch for domestic use or a professional brewer was supplying a town, water formed the foundation of the process. The quality of that water mattered. Brewers paid attention to taste, clarity, and local reputation because these factors affected the final drink. In other words, even when people were consuming ale, they were still relying on the local water supply. The relationship was not an escape from water. It was a transformation of water. Across much of medieval Europe, ale and beer occupied an important place in daily life. Yet these beverages varied enormously. Modern drinkers often imagine something similar to contemporary beer, but many medieval drinks were weaker, fresher, and intended for relatively quick consumption. A household ale might contain far less alcohol than many modern beers. Children could consume weak forms. Laborers might drink them with meals. Monastic communities often included them in daily allowances. These beverages supplied calories, hydration, and familiarity. Most importantly, they fit naturally into the rhythms of everyday life. The brewing process itself offered certain advantages. Water was heated. Ingredients were added. Fermentation occurred. While medieval brewers had no concept of microorganisms as modern science understands them, the process sometimes reduced particular dangers associated with contaminated water. Yet it would be a mistake to imagine brewing as a perfect safety system. Not every batch was equally successful. Not every brewer was equally skilled. Storage conditions varied. Ingredients differed. Contamination remained possible. Furthermore, many people continued drinking plain water alongside other beverages. The world was not divided into people who drank water and people who drank ale. Most communities used both. What makes this subject especially interesting is how brewing reveals medieval attitudes toward risk. People did not need scientific explanations to notice practical outcomes. Generations observed that certain drinks seemed dependable. Certain methods worked. Certain sources were preferred. Traditions developed accordingly. The process was empirical rather than scientific in the modern sense, but it was still based on observation. And observation was one of medieval society's most valuable tools. Consider the typical household. Most families could not spend their days conducting experiments. Life required constant labor. Fields needed tending. Animals required care. Food had to be prepared. Clothing had to be repaired. Children needed supervision. Under such conditions, knowledge that consistently produced acceptable results became highly valuable. People remembered which water source seemed best. They remembered which brewer was trusted. They remembered which seasons brought problems. This accumulated experience formed a kind of practical intelligence passed between generations. Sometimes it protected communities remarkably well. Sometimes it failed in ways nobody could understand. The invisible nature of contamination remained the central challenge. A clear stream might be dangerous. A respected well might become compromised. A trusted practice might suddenly stop working because conditions had changed. This uncertainty affected travelers particularly strongly. For someone living in a familiar village, local knowledge offered some protection. A traveler possessed no such advantage. Imagine moving through medieval Europe on foot. The roads vary from reasonably maintained routes to muddy tracks. Some journeys last days. Others require weeks. Inns are scattered unevenly across the landscape. Weather changes unpredictably. Rivers must be crossed. Food supplies fluctuate. And throughout the journey, water remains a constant concern. A traveler entering an unfamiliar settlement faces immediate questions. Which well is trusted? Which stream is safe? Where do locals obtain their drinking water? Who can provide reliable information? The answers are not always obvious. Visitors often depended heavily on local advice. Innkeepers, merchants, monks, and residents served as guides to unfamiliar environments. Reputation became extraordinarily important. A spring known for good water might attract travelers repeatedly. A town associated with poor conditions might acquire a negative reputation. Pilgrimage routes often developed informal networks of practical knowledge regarding food, lodging, and water. In this sense, water influenced movement across entire regions. The challenge intensified during large gatherings. Markets provide a useful example. Medieval markets brought together substantial numbers of people and animals. Merchants arrived from surrounding areas. Livestock gathered. Temporary populations expanded dramatically. Suddenly, local water systems faced increased pressure. Additional people required additional supplies. More animals created more waste. Crowding increased opportunities for contamination. Market authorities frequently concerned themselves with practical infrastructure because successful commerce depended upon basic necessities. Water was one of them. The same principle applied to fairs, religious festivals, military musters, and major pilgrimage destinations. Any concentration of people altered the local balance between supply and demand. And whenever demand increased, vulnerabilities became easier to expose. This relationship between population density and water risk becomes even clearer when examining some of medieval Europe's largest urban centers. Take London as an example. By medieval standards, London was enormous. Its population expanded significantly during different periods of the Middle Ages. Trade networks connected it to distant regions. Economic activity intensified. Construction accelerated. All of these developments brought benefits. All of them also created pressure. The city depended upon multiple water sources. Wells existed. Streams flowed through the urban landscape. The River Thames dominated the environment. Conduits imported water from outside the city. Each source offered advantages. Each presented difficulties. The Thames itself illustrates the complexity perfectly. The river was essential to London's existence. It enabled commerce. It connected the city to wider trade networks. It provided resources. Yet it also received waste. As population increased, the challenge became increasingly difficult to manage. Medieval authorities were not unaware of these problems. Complaints appear in records. Regulations were issued. Attempts at improvement occurred. But solving water issues in a rapidly growing city required capabilities that often exceeded contemporary institutions. This pattern repeated elsewhere. Paris confronted similar pressures. Florence faced its own challenges. Cologne, York, Bruges, and many other towns wrestled with related concerns. Each city developed unique solutions shaped by geography, economics, politics, and local tradition. Yet all confronted the same underlying reality. Water connected every aspect of urban life, and urban success often intensified water-related risks. One particularly revealing example comes from the world of crafts and manufacturing. Many medieval industries depended heavily on water. Tanners processed hides. Fullers cleaned and treated cloth. Dyers colored textiles. Metalworkers used water in various stages of production. Millers relied upon flowing rivers. These activities supported economic growth. They created jobs. They generated wealth. Yet they also introduced new forms of pollution. Tanneries, in particular, developed reputations for unpleasant smells and waste products. Many towns attempted to place such operations away from central residential areas. This was partly because of odor. It was also because people recognized that certain activities affected local water quality. Again, this demonstrates an important point. Medieval communities often understood practical consequences without understanding microbiological causes. They observed that some activities fouled water. They acted accordingly when possible. The challenge lay in balancing competing needs. A town required economic activity. A town required clean water. These goals did not always align perfectly. Sometimes compromise became unavoidable. This tension produced fascinating patterns in urban geography. Certain trades clustered near specific waterways. Residential districts developed around preferred sources. Monasteries sometimes maintained carefully managed water systems separated from surrounding activities. Wealthier households occasionally secured better access. The physical layout of medieval towns often reflects an ongoing negotiation over water. And beneath all these arrangements existed another reality that modern audiences sometimes overlook. Water was not merely a source of health concerns. It was also a source of anxiety, comfort, status, and even identity. Think about the emotional experience of dependence. A family relying on a well during a dry summer would watch water levels carefully. A community whose spring began to weaken might worry about the future. A town investing heavily in a new conduit expressed confidence in long-term growth. Water carried psychological significance. Reliable access created security. Uncertainty created tension. These feelings were not abstract. They shaped decisions. They influenced politics. They affected community relationships. In some cases, water even acquired legal importance. Rights to springs, streams, and watercourses could become subjects of dispute. Landowners argued over access. Villages disagreed about usage. Monasteries defended long-standing claims. Municipal governments attempted regulation. Water possessed value because life depended upon it. Where value exists, conflict often follows. Yet not all water stories involve conflict. Some reveal remarkable ingenuity. Medieval engineers are sometimes underestimated because their technology appears simple compared to modern infrastructure. But many water systems required substantial expertise. Constructing a conduit demanded careful planning. Maintaining flow over distance required understanding gradients. Building effective drainage involved observation and experience. Deep wells required extraordinary effort. Cistern systems required organization. None of these achievements happened accidentally. They emerged from generations of accumulated knowledge. Monastic communities often became particularly skilled in this area. Many monasteries functioned as centers of practical expertise. Their relative stability allowed long-term projects. Their organizational structures supported maintenance. Their daily routines benefited from reliable water management. Archaeological evidence frequently reveals sophisticated arrangements involving channels, drains, washing facilities, fish ponds, and supply systems. These were not modern plumbing networks, but they demonstrate deliberate design. Water was being managed systematically. This becomes especially interesting when we consider medieval ideas about cleanliness. Popular culture often portrays the Middle Ages as uniformly filthy. The reality is considerably more complicated. Standards differed from modern expectations. Access varied enormously. Resources were uneven. Yet many medieval people cared deeply about cleanliness. They washed. They bathed when circumstances allowed. They laundered clothing. They maintained household spaces. They associated cleanliness with health, comfort, social respectability, and sometimes religious virtue. Water played a central role in all of this. The challenge was not a lack of interest. The challenge was access. A wealthy urban resident and a poor laborer experienced water differently. A monastery and an isolated farm faced different possibilities. A riverside settlement and a hilltop fortress confronted different constraints. Medieval cleanliness was shaped less by attitude than by infrastructure. This distinction matters because it reveals how closely daily habits depended upon environmental realities. People worked within the limits of their surroundings. Sometimes those limits were generous. Sometimes they were severe, and nowhere were those limits more obvious than during periods of disease. When epidemics appeared, attention often turned toward water. Not because people understood germ transmission, but because water formed part of the environment that seemed connected to health. Observers noticed patterns. Certain places suffered more than others. Certain conditions appeared suspicious. Certain sources developed reputations. Explanations varied widely, but water frequently entered the discussion. The challenge was separating correlation from causation. A foul-smelling stream might indeed indicate unhealthy conditions. A clean-looking well might hide contamination. Communities were trying to interpret signals without seeing the full picture. It was like assembling a puzzle while several crucial pieces remained invisible. Even so, these efforts reveal something admirable about medieval society. People were paying attention. They were asking questions. They were seeking explanations. They were attempting solutions. The story of medieval water is not simply a story of danger. It is also a story of adaptation, of observation, of problem-solving, of communities struggling to manage an essential resource with the tools available to them. And as towns expanded, trade intensified, and populations became increasingly interconnected, one particular challenge would begin to expose just how fragile these systems could be. Because water did not merely influence individual households or isolated villages. It could shape the course of entire outbreaks, linking distant lives through pathways that remained almost completely unseen. Because water did not merely influence individual households or isolated villages. It could shape the course of entire outbreaks, linking distant lives through pathways that remained almost completely unseen. For a medieval person, disease rarely arrived with a clear explanation. An illness began in one house. A few days later, another family fell sick. Then perhaps a neighboring street. Sometimes the pattern stopped. Sometimes it spread. Sometimes an entire community found itself caught in a wave of suffering that seemed to emerge from nowhere. Without modern microbiology, these events could appear mysterious, even when people searched carefully for causes. And they did search. One of the most persistent misconceptions about the medieval world is that people simply accepted disease as fate. In reality, communities often reacted with intense concern. Authorities issued regulations. Religious institutions organized prayers and processions. Physicians debated explanations. Families altered routines. Travelers avoided places with bad reputations. People were trying to understand what was happening. The difficulty was that many of the most important connections remained invisible. Water occupied an unusual position within this uncertainty. Sometimes it was correctly suspected. Sometimes it was ignored. Sometimes it was only one factor among many. And sometimes it became part of a much larger environmental puzzle involving food, weather, crowding, waste disposal, and movement between regions. Imagine a busy market town during a particularly warm summer. The wells are lower than usual. Streams flow more slowly. Animals crowd around limited water sources. Waste accumulates more quickly in the heat. Food spoils faster. Travelers continue arriving. Trade continues. Life goes on. Then sickness begins appearing. To modern observers, the conditions might immediately suggest heightened risk. To medieval observers, they suggested something was wrong as well, but the explanation could take many forms. Perhaps the weather had corrupted the air. Perhaps unusual environmental conditions had disturbed the body's balance. Perhaps a nearby marsh was producing harmful vapors. Perhaps the town had somehow become unhealthy. Many of these theories sound strange today, yet they often emerged from genuine observation. After all, hot weather really did correlate with certain outbreaks. Crowded places often were more dangerous. Foul-smelling environments frequently coincided with poor sanitation. The observations themselves were not always incorrect. The challenge lay in understanding the mechanism behind them. This distinction is important because it reminds us that medieval people were often seeing real patterns. They simply lacked access to the invisible world of microorganisms connecting those patterns together. One particularly revealing example comes from the way communities responded to foul smells. Modern audiences sometimes laugh at historical fears of bad air. Yet in many cases, foul smells genuinely indicated unhealthy conditions. Rotting waste, contaminated water, overcrowded environments, and decaying organic matter often produced powerful odors. People associated these smells with illness because illness frequently appeared in the same places. The conclusion was understandable. What they could not know was that the smell itself was often less dangerous than the conditions producing it. This created a fascinating situation. A medieval town might take steps that improved health for reasons that were technically incorrect. Officials could clean streets because they feared foul air. The result might reduce contamination. The explanation differed from modern science, but the practical outcome could still be beneficial. History is full of such ironies, and water repeatedly sits at the center of them. Take public wells. A community might protect a well because contamination seemed morally offensive, aesthetically unpleasant, or associated with bad smells. These motivations could lead to genuinely useful protections. The people involved did not need germ theory to recognize that keeping filth away from drinking water was sensible. In this way, practical wisdom often compensated, at least partially, for scientific limitations. But only partially, because there remained dangers that observation alone struggled to detect. A contaminated well could appear perfectly normal. A spring might look pristine while receiving unseen pollutants. A storage vessel could harbor contamination despite appearing clean. The more invisible the danger, the harder it became to manage. This challenge grew increasingly significant as medieval trade networks expanded. By the High Middle Ages, Europe was becoming more interconnected. Merchants traveled farther. Cities grew larger. Pilgrims crossed long distances. Ships linked coastal regions. Rivers connected inland settlements to wider commercial systems. Movement increased. Goods moved. People moved. Animals moved. Diseases moved. Water frequently sat somewhere within these networks. A river that served one community flowed onward to another. A port city's water challenges affected thousands. A pilgrimage center hosting visitors from multiple regions faced constant pressure on local infrastructure. Every increase in connectivity created opportunities for prosperity. It also created opportunities for vulnerability. This is one reason why major medieval cities often struggled so visibly with sanitation. Success generated scale. Scale generated complexity. Complexity exposed weaknesses. Consider the simple act of disposing of waste. In a small settlement, the problem remained relatively manageable. In a city of tens of thousands, it became far more difficult. More people produced more refuse. More animals produced more manure. More industries generated more waste products. More activity meant more pressure on local waterways. Medieval governments recognized these issues repeatedly. Records survive describing efforts to clean streets, regulate dumping, maintain drainage systems, and protect certain water sources. Such documents reveal a world actively attempting to cope with environmental pressures. They do not describe a society unaware of sanitation concerns. Rather, they describe a society struggling against problems that frequently exceeded available technology. And technology mattered enormously. Modern water systems depend on pumps, filtration, treatment facilities, underground pipe networks, chemical testing, and scientific monitoring. Medieval communities possessed none of these advantages. Everything depended on gravity, labor, local knowledge, engineering skill, and continual maintenance. Remove any one of those elements and problems emerged quickly. Conduit required repair. A drain became blocked. A well collapsed. A channel filled with sediment. A spring weakened. The system deteriorated. Water management was not a one-time achievement. It was an ongoing responsibility. This reality helps explain why monasteries often appear so frequently in discussions of medieval infrastructure. Unlike many secular institutions, monasteries sometimes enjoyed unusual continuity. Generations of monks could maintain the same site over centuries. Knowledge accumulated. Records survived. Maintenance routines developed. Water systems could be refined gradually over long periods. Archaeologists often find evidence of careful planning in these environments. Channels directed flow where needed. Latrines were positioned with drainage in mind. Washing areas were organized. Fish ponds integrated into broader systems. Gardens benefited from controlled supplies. The result was not modern sanitation, but it was systematic management. In some respects, monasteries functioned as experiments in environmental organization. They reveal what medieval communities could achieve when stability, resources, and long-term planning aligned. Yet even monasteries remained vulnerable to nature. Droughts still occurred. Floods still happened. Wells still failed. Water remained a resource that could never be entirely controlled. This uncertainty shaped everyday psychology more than modern audiences often realize. Today, many people rarely think about where their water originates. The system operates largely out of sight. Medieval people lived much closer to the process. They saw the source. They carried the bucket. They observed changing water levels. They noticed seasonal variation. They monitored conditions directly. Water was not an invisible service. It was a visible part of life. A shrinking well could become the subject of conversation. A damaged conduit could concern an entire neighborhood. A contaminated stream might affect daily routines immediately. These experiences created a level of environmental awareness that modern infrastructure often conceals. People knew their local landscape intimately because survival required it. They knew where springs emerged. They knew which routes became muddy after rain. They knew which streams ran reliably during dry periods. They knew which wells tasted best. Such knowledge carried real value. In many cases, it represented generations of accumulated observation. Parents taught children. Neighbors exchanged information. Travelers shared advice. Communities built collective memory around water. This memory could become surprisingly detailed. Certain springs acquired reputations extending far beyond their immediate area. Some wells became associated with legends. Particular water sources gained religious significance. Others became known for unusual taste or perceived healing qualities. Medieval people did not separate practical concerns from cultural meaning as sharply as modern societies often do. Water existed within both worlds simultaneously. It was a resource. It was a symbol. It was part of daily labor. It was part of spiritual life. Holy wells provide an especially interesting example. Across many regions of medieval Europe, certain springs and wells became associated with saints, miracles, or sacred traditions. Pilgrims visited them seeking healing. Communities protected them. Stories accumulated around them over generations. To modern observers, such practices may seem entirely religious. Yet practical realities often existed alongside spiritual interpretations. Many holy wells happened to provide reliable, attractive water sources. A spring producing unusually clear water naturally attracted attention. Communities developed cultural frameworks explaining its significance. Spiritual meaning and environmental value reinforced one another. This combination appears repeatedly throughout medieval history. The practical and the symbolic rarely existed in isolation. The same was true within the household. Consider something as ordinary as storing water. A modern kitchen faucet delivers water on demand. A medieval household relied on containers, buckets, barrels, jugs, tubs, cisterns. Every container required labor. Every container required maintenance. Every container introduced potential complications. Water stored too long could lose freshness. Sediment accumulated. Dust entered. Insects found access. Animals occasionally interfered. Storage became another stage in the water journey. A source could be relatively clean while household handling introduced new risks. Again, the problem was rarely dramatic. It was cumulative. Small imperfections repeated day after day. The medieval experience of water was filled with such accumulations. Tiny vulnerabilities layered upon one another. A slightly contaminated source. Poorly maintained container. A crowded environment. A warm season. A growing population. Individually manageable. Collectively significant. And yet, despite these challenges, medieval society functioned. This fact is easy to overlook because historical narratives often emphasize crisis. But most days were not crises. Most days involved ordinary routines. People fetched water, prepared meals, worked fields, conducted trade, raised families, maintained households. The water system, imperfect though it was, usually functioned well enough to support life. That phrase appears again, well enough. Medieval communities often operated within margins that modern societies would consider uncomfortably narrow. Their systems did not need perfection. They needed adequacy. The problem emerged when conditions pushed those systems beyond their limits. A severe drought, a flood, rapid urban growth, military conflict, population concentration, environmental change. These pressures could expose weaknesses that remained hidden during ordinary times. And perhaps no circumstance exposed those weaknesses more dramatically than war. Because while peaceful communities worried about daily supply, armies confronted water under entirely different conditions. A marching force could consume astonishing quantities. Thousands of soldiers required drinking water. Horses required even more. Camps generated waste. Local sources faced sudden pressure. Wells became strategic assets. Rivers became lifelines. A commander who failed to secure water risked disaster regardless of battlefield skill. Medieval military history is often told through battles and sieges. Yet beneath those dramatic events existed a quieter reality. Armies marched where water allowed. Camps formed where supply existed. Campaigns slowed when resources became scarce. Water influenced strategy long before swords ever crossed. The same was true for castles under siege. Defenders might possess strong walls, experienced soldiers, and ample food. But if their water system failed, every other advantage began to weaken. This reality forced medieval engineers to think carefully about security. How deep should a well be? How large should a cistern become? How much rainwater could be collected? How long could supplies last? These were not abstract questions. Entire communities depended upon the answers. And some of the most remarkable engineering projects of the medieval world emerged directly from that pressure. As rulers, monks, town officials, and military planners all confronted the same stubborn reality. Water was never optional, and securing it often demanded far more ingenuity than modern observers first imagine. At the same time, the solutions they developed would reveal something unexpected about the medieval world itself, because the history of water is also the history of technology, and some of the methods used to capture, transport, and protect water were far more sophisticated than many people today would assume. At the same time, the solutions they developed would reveal something unexpected about the medieval world itself, because the history of water is also the history of technology, and some of the methods used to capture, transport, and protect water were far more sophisticated than many people today would assume. One of the quiet surprises awaiting anyone who studies medieval water systems closely is how often they encounter engineering rather than improvisation. Popular imagination tends to picture medieval life as largely reactive. People coping with whatever nature happened to provide. Villagers drawing water from a nearby stream. Towns surviving with little planning. Yet when we look at surviving evidence, a different picture frequently emerges. Again and again, we find communities investing significant labor, resources, and expertise into controlling water. Not perfectly, not with modern technology, but with remarkable determination. Consider a medieval town that wished to bring fresh spring water from several miles away. The challenge was substantial. The water had to flow continuously. The route had to maintain a workable gradient. Construction crews needed to dig channels, lay pipes, or build conduits. The system required protection from damage, weather, theft, and contamination. And once completed, it required maintenance. Leaves accumulated, sediment settled, pipes cracked, channels shifted, roots interfered. The work never truly ended. Yet towns undertook such projects because water justified extraordinary effort. The investment tells us something important about medieval priorities. Communities may not have understood bacteria, but they certainly understood value. Fresh water improved daily life. Reliable water supported growth. Abundant water encouraged commerce. And good water could become a source of civic pride. In some cities, public conduits became landmarks. People gathered around them. Water carriers filled containers from them. Residents relied upon them. Visitors noticed them. These structures represented far more than utility. They symbolized organization, stability, prosperity. A town capable of importing clean water projected confidence. Yet even these impressive systems contained vulnerabilities. Medieval pipes were often made from materials such as wood, lead, clay, or stone. Each came with advantages and disadvantages. Wooden pipes could be relatively practical and widely available. Clay systems could function effectively under the right conditions. Stone channels offered durability. Lead, used in some places, created a particularly interesting historical irony. Medieval builders valued lead because it was workable, durable, and useful for transporting water. The long-term health risks associated with lead exposure were not fully understood. Here again we encounter a recurring pattern. A technological solution solved one problem while quietly introducing another. Human history is filled with such trade-offs. The people constructing these systems acted rationally according to the knowledge available to them. Future generations would identify new risks, but those future generations would create their own unforeseen complications as well. Water history reminds us that every era operates with partial understanding. Medieval communities simply faced a different set of unknowns. The challenge of maintenance reveals another overlooked aspect of medieval life. Infrastructure required people. A conduit did not maintain itself. A well did not repair itself. A drain did not clear itself. Behind every functioning water system stood countless hours of labor. Workers cleaned channels. Officials inspected supplies. Monastic communities organized maintenance schedules. Town governments collected funds. Craftsmen performed repairs. The ordinary reliability of water depended upon extraordinary amounts of often invisible work. Modern societies experience something similar, though much of that labor remains hidden behind municipal systems. Medieval people saw it more directly. They witnessed repairs. They noticed failures. They understood that water security depended upon continual effort. This awareness shaped how communities thought about responsibility. If a conduit broke, someone had to fix it. If a spring became obstructed, someone had to clear it. If a public well deteriorated, the consequences affected everyone. Water management therefore encouraged forms of collective action, sometimes successful, sometimes contentious, sometimes surprisingly sophisticated. Consider a town debating the funding of a new water project. The arguments would sound remarkably familiar to modern ears. Who should pay? Who benefits most? How urgent is the need? Is the existing system sufficient? What happens if nothing is done? These questions appear throughout history because water repeatedly forces societies to confront them. Water exposes the relationship between individual interests and collective needs. A merchant may prefer lower taxes. A household may prefer cheaper expenses. Yet everyone benefits from reliable infrastructure. Negotiating those competing priorities is not a modern challenge. It is a human challenge. Medieval communities faced it constantly. The same dynamic appears within castles. To modern visitors, castles often seem dominated by military concerns. Thick walls, towers, gatehouses, battlements. Yet if we examine many surviving sites closely, water emerges as one of the most important design considerations. A castle under siege effectively became a sealed environment. Whatever resources existed inside the walls had to sustain the population for potentially months. Food mattered, firewood mattered, medical supplies mattered, but water mattered every single day. In many cases, castle wells rank among the most impressive engineering achievements associated with these structures. Some descended extraordinary distances through solid rock. Digging them required patience, expertise, and enormous labor. Imagine workers spending months or even years cutting downward through stone using hand tools. Progress measured in inches. Ventilation challenges. Constant danger. Uncertainty about when water would finally appear. Yet rulers accepted these costs because the alternative was vulnerability. Without water, a fortress remained dependent upon external supply. Dependence invited risk. A deep well offered security, or at least the possibility of security. Even then, certainty remained elusive. Wells could become contaminated. Water levels could fluctuate. Mechanical equipment could fail. Storage systems could prove inadequate. Medieval engineers sought reliability, but reliability never meant perfection. This reality becomes even more evident when we examine water lifting technology. Obtaining water was one challenge. Moving it was another. Gravity helped when water flowed downhill. Problems emerged when communities needed water elsewhere. Various solutions appeared across medieval Europe. Buckets remained common. So did simple lifting devices. More complex systems sometimes employed wheels, animal power, or other mechanical arrangements. The exact methods varied by region and circumstance. What matters is the underlying principle. Medieval societies continuously experimented with ways to reduce labor. Carrying water by hand was exhausting. Any innovation that improved efficiency possessed value. In this respect, water technology forms part of a much broader story about medieval ingenuity. The Middle Ages were not a period of technological stagnation. They witnessed substantial developments in agriculture, architecture, metallurgy, transportation, and mechanical systems. Water management belonged within that larger pattern. Some innovations succeeded widely. Others remained local. Some disappeared. Others endured for centuries. Yet all emerged from the same practical reality. Water created problems that demanded solutions. And solutions encouraged creativity. This creativity becomes particularly visible in monasteries. Earlier, we touched upon monastic water systems. It is worth lingering there a little longer because they reveal something remarkable about medieval organization. Many monasteries attempted to create environments governed by routine. Every aspect of daily life followed established rhythms. Prayer, work, meals, study, rest. Water had to support all of these activities. Consequently, some communities developed surprisingly elaborate arrangements. Fresh water entered the complex. Wastewater exited through separate routes. Kitchens received supply. Gardens benefited from irrigation. Fish ponds supported food production. Washing facilities served practical and ritual purposes. Latrines incorporated flowing water where geography allowed. None of this happened accidentally. It required planning. It required maintenance. It required institutional memory. A monastery founded in 1 century might continue refining its water system across several generations. Knowledge accumulated gradually. Improvements built upon earlier experience. This long-term perspective provided advantages unavailable to many secular communities. A town government might change. A lord might die. A war might disrupt administration. But a stable monastery could preserve expertise for decades or centuries. Water systems often reflected that continuity. Yet continuity never eliminated environmental uncertainty. Drought remained a constant threat. In modern societies, drought often appears as a regional news story. In the medieval world, it could become a deeply personal experience. Wells fell. Springs weakened. Streams shrank. Crop yields suffered. Livestock faced difficulties. Communities adapted as best they could. Sometimes water had to be transported from greater distances. Sometimes usage changed. Sometimes conflicts emerged. Drought exposed hidden assumptions about abundance. A source considered reliable suddenly appeared fragile. The emotional impact could be significant. Water insecurity creates anxiety because it touches every aspect of life simultaneously. Drinking, cooking, cleaning, agriculture, animals, industry, everything depends upon it. Medieval communities understood this viscerally. They did not encounter water scarcity as an abstract concept. They encountered it as a daily reality. And drought was only one challenge. Winter created another. Modern audiences often imagine winter primarily as a problem of cold. For medieval communities, frozen water introduced additional complications. Wells could become difficult to access. Surface sources froze. Travel became harder. Livestock required care. Storage assumed greater importance. Communities accustomed to drawing water from nearby streams suddenly faced obstacles. The season altered routines. Water remained available, but obtaining it demanded more effort. This seasonal rhythm influenced medieval thinking in subtle ways. People learned to anticipate change. Summer and winter created different conditions. Wet years differed from dry years. Flood seasons differed from periods of scarcity. Water management, therefore, became inseparable from time itself. Communities planned around cycles. They observed patterns. They adapted expectations. Such adaptation forms one of the most impressive features of medieval life. People operated within environments characterized by uncertainty, yet they developed systems capable of functioning across generations. Imperfect systems, vulnerable systems, but functioning systems nonetheless. This perspective helps us avoid another common misunderstanding. Medieval water was risky, but risk did not mean constant catastrophe. Most days, people successfully obtained the water they needed. Most towns continued functioning. Most farms survived. Most journeys were completed. History tends to preserve crises because crises leave records. Yet ordinary success deserves attention as well. The fact that medieval societies endured, expanded, traded, built, governed, worshipped, and created culture on a large scale tells us something important. Their water systems worked often enough. The problem was that often enough remained very different from the expectations of modern infrastructure. Failure remained closer. Contamination remained harder to detect. Scarcity remained more immediate. And this difference shaped everyday behavior in subtle ways. Consider the role of water carriers. In many towns, specialized individuals earned livelihoods transporting water. The existence of such occupations reveals much about urban life. Not every household possessed convenient access. Not everyone had time to fetch supplies personally. Water could become a service, commodity, a source of income. The water carrier connected infrastructure to daily life. Their work reminds us that even basic necessities generated economic opportunities. The same pattern appears elsewhere. Well construction required skilled labor. Conduit maintenance required expertise. Brewing depended upon water access. Mills depended upon flow. Fisheries depended upon waterways. Countless occupations intersected with water in some form. Water was not merely something people consumed. It was something around which economies formed. And where economies form, power follows. This brings us toward another fascinating dimension of medieval water history: control. Who controlled access to a spring? Who possessed rights to a river? Who decided how water could be used? Who paid for infrastructure? Who benefited most from improvements? These questions became increasingly important as communities grew larger and resources became more valuable. Water was never entirely free from politics. In fact, some of the most revealing disputes in medieval records begin not with kings or wars, but with something seemingly much smaller. A channel diverted, a stream blocked, a mill constructed in the wrong place, or a community suddenly discovering that the water it had depended upon for generations was now entangled in questions of ownership, authority, and competing claims. In fact, some of the most revealing disputes in medieval records begin not with kings or wars, but with something seemingly much smaller. A channel diverted, a stream blocked, a mill constructed in the wrong place, or a community suddenly discovering that the water it had depended upon for generations was now entangled in questions of ownership, authority, and competing claims. At first glance, such disagreements can seem almost mundane. A modern reader might encounter a legal dispute over a mill race or a watercourse and wonder why so much attention was devoted to what appears to be a minor local issue. But to medieval communities, these matters were rarely minor. Water determined livelihoods. A diverted stream could affect crops. A new mill could alter river flow. A blocked channel could change drainage patterns. A contested spring could affect an entire settlement. When survival depends upon a resource, access to that resource becomes political almost automatically. This was true in villages. It was true in towns. It was true in monasteries. And it was true in the estates of nobles whose lands depended upon productive agriculture. One of the most fascinating aspects of medieval water history is how it reveals the hidden structure of power. Most people think of power in terms of armies, castles, crowns, and laws, yet practical control often mattered just as much. Who controlled the bridge? Who controlled the market? Who controlled the mill? Who controlled the water? These questions shaped daily experience far more directly than distant political events. A peasant farmer might never meet a king, but he would certainly notice if access to a stream changed. A town resident might know little about national politics, but she would immediately feel the effects of a damaged conduit or an overcrowded well. Water transformed abstract authority into everyday reality. This relationship became especially important because medieval economies relied heavily upon water-powered technology. When many people imagine medieval machinery, they think of simple hand tools. In reality, water power became one of the most important energy sources in medieval Europe. Flowing water performed work. It ground grain, processed cloth, powered industrial activities. It increased productivity. In many regions, rivers became economic engines. A mill was not merely a convenient machine. It was infrastructure, and infrastructure generated both wealth and conflict. Imagine a river flowing through a valley. For centuries, local communities have used the water in relatively predictable ways. Then someone constructs a new mill. The mill requires a controlled flow. Channels are dug. Water is redirected. The local hydrology changes. Perhaps downstream users receive less water. Perhaps seasonal flooding patterns shift. Perhaps a neighboring landowner believes his rights have been violated. Suddenly, a technical project becomes a legal dispute. The story of water repeatedly becomes the story of competing interests. And because water moves, boundaries become difficult. Land can be measured. Buildings can be mapped. But rivers flow. Streams shift. Floods alter landscapes. Channels change course. Water resists the neat divisions humans prefer. This created endless opportunities for disagreement. Yet these conflicts also reveal something positive. They demonstrate how valuable water was considered. People argued because it mattered. Communities invested resources because it mattered. Governments regulated because it mattered. Water occupied a central place in medieval life precisely because so much depended upon it. This dependence becomes even clearer when we look beyond Europe's towns and examine agriculture. For most medieval people, farming remained the foundation of existence. Food production determined prosperity, stability, and survival, and agriculture depended heavily on water. Not always through large-scale irrigation in the way some ancient civilizations had practiced, but through rainfall, drainage, seasonal patterns, and access to reliable sources. Farmers lived in close relationship with water because they had little choice. Too little rain could threaten crops. Too much rain could destroy them. Flooded fields became unusable. Drought weakened harvests. Livestock required watering. Meadows depended upon moisture. Every season carried uncertainty. This uncertainty shaped medieval attitudes toward nature. Modern societies often expect consistency. Medieval communities expected variability. Weather changed. Rivers rose. Wells fluctuated. Harvests varied. Water existed within a broader environment that remained only partially predictable. People adapted as best they could. They observed patterns. They accumulated local knowledge. They learned which fields drained well, which streams flooded frequently, which springs remained reliable during dry years. This environmental knowledge represented a valuable form of expertise. Sometimes entire communities organized themselves around it. Villages emerged where water access was dependable. Roads followed practical routes between sources. Farms developed in areas where conditions supported agriculture. Water quietly influenced settlement geography across centuries. We often notice castles because they survive dramatically in the landscape. We notice cathedrals because of their scale. But water influenced where ordinary people lived just as powerfully. A spring could encourage settlement. A river crossing could create a town. A reliable well could support expansion. A poor water supply could limit growth. Long before urban planners existed, water shaped development. And it did so relentlessly. Even the placement of individual houses could reflect practical considerations. How far must water be carried? How difficult is access in winter? Does flooding occur? Is the source reliable? Such questions affected daily labor. Daily labor affected quality of life. The connection was direct. Consider the simple physical effort involved. A bucket of water is surprisingly heavy. Carrying several buckets every day, year after year, represents a substantial investment of energy. The closer the source, the easier life became. The farther the source, the greater the burden. This reality particularly affected women and children in many communities, because they frequently handled much of the water collection. Historical records often focus on political elites. Yet water reminds us that ordinary labor formed the foundation of society. Someone carried the bucket. Someone maintained the container. Someone walked the path to the well. Someone monitored supplies. The entire system depended upon countless repetitive tasks that rarely appear in grand historical narratives. Water history allows us to recover some of that hidden world. It reveals how ordinary people interacted with infrastructure every day. And it reveals something else as well. The medieval experience of water was deeply sensory. Today, water often arrives anonymously through pipes. Medieval people experienced it directly. They saw it, tasted it, smelled it, touched it, heard it. A spring had a particular flavor. A stream had a familiar sound. A well possessed a known depth. Seasonal changes could be observed directly. Water was not an abstraction. It was part of lived experience. This sensory relationship influenced how people judged quality. We touched earlier on the importance of appearance and smell. It is worth exploring further. Medieval communities often classified water according to characteristics that could be observed without scientific instruments. Was it clear? Was it cold? Was it flowing? Was it stagnant? Did it smell unpleasant? Did it leave sediment? Did it taste unusual? These observations formed practical evaluation systems. Sometimes they worked well. Sometimes they failed. Running water often was preferable to stagnant water. Fresh springs often did provide good quality supplies. Foul smells frequently indicated contamination. The challenge arose because dangerous water could sometimes appear completely normal. This is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the entire story. Medieval people were paying attention, yet certain threats remained invisible. A contaminated source might still look attractive. A dangerous well might retain an excellent reputation. A seemingly healthy environment could conceal serious problems. Modern science gives us tools to detect what medieval observers could not. But that advantage can sometimes make us underestimate how difficult the challenge actually was. Imagine trying to protect a community from dangers that cannot be seen, measured, or fully explained. That was the reality. The people involved were not failing to notice obvious evidence. The evidence itself was often hidden. And because it was hidden, communities frequently relied on reputation. Reputation became a form of infrastructure. A trusted spring attracted users. A respected well maintained status. Certain water carriers earned confidence. Certain brewers became known for quality. Information traveled through social networks. In many ways, trust served as a substitute for testing. People relied upon collective experience because few alternatives existed. Most of the time, this worked reasonably well, until conditions changed. And conditions always changed eventually. A growing population could overwhelm an old source. Environmental shifts could alter water quality. Construction projects could affect drainage. A flood could transform local conditions in a matter of days. The reliability of the past offered no guarantee for the future. This vulnerability helps explain why communities sometimes reacted strongly to water-related threats. Water insecurity had a way of touching everything at once. Food production, trade, health, sanitation, domestic life, industry, religion, military defense, all depended upon reliable access. Few resources possessed such universal importance. Even firewood, food, or building materials affected particular aspects of life more than others. Water touched them all. Which brings us to another subtle but important point. Medieval people did not merely consume water. They lived inside water systems. The distinction matters. A person drinking from a well participates in a larger network. The well depends on groundwater. Groundwater depends on rainfall. Rainfall interacts with landscape. The landscape contains animals, waste, agriculture, settlements, and industry. Every component affects the others. Medieval communities understood pieces of this interconnectedness. They observed relationships. They recognized consequences. But they could never see the entire system. Neither, in truth, can we. Modern science has revealed vastly more than medieval observers could know. Yet even today, water management remains complex. Floods still surprise us. Droughts still challenge us. Infrastructure still fails. Contamination still occurs. Water continues to resist complete control. This continuity creates an unexpected connection between the medieval world and our own. Their challenges were greater. Their tools were fewer. But the underlying relationship remains recognizable. Humans depend upon water. Water remains difficult to manage perfectly, and every society develops systems reflecting its knowledge and limitations. Medieval systems reflected medieval limitations, yet they also reflected medieval strengths: patience, observation, adaptation, local expertise, community cooperation, practical engineering. These strengths become particularly visible when we examine some of the largest water projects of the era. Certain cities invested extraordinary resources in transporting water over considerable distances. Some monasteries developed sophisticated hydraulic arrangements. Certain castles achieved remarkable feats of water engineering. Such projects remind us that necessity can drive innovation. When communities faced persistent challenges, they often responded creatively. The solutions might appear simple beside modern infrastructure, but judged within their own context, many were impressive achievements. And perhaps the most remarkable aspect is that they often succeeded for generations. A conduit might operate for decades. A well might serve a community for centuries. A spring might support settlement across multiple lifetimes. Reliability, though imperfect, could endure. Yet every successful system created its own paradox. The more dependable a source became, the more people relied upon it. The more people relied upon it, the greater the consequences when something went wrong. Success increased dependence. Dependence increased vulnerability. This pattern appears repeatedly throughout history. Medieval water systems were no exception. A town growing around a trusted conduit became vulnerable to disruption. A community depending upon a famous spring faced risks if conditions changed. A castle relying on a single well carried hidden dangers. The stronger the reliance, the greater the stakes. And because the stakes were so high, water often occupied a curious position in medieval thought. It was ordinary enough to be taken for granted on a good day, yet essential enough to become a source of anxiety during difficult times. Most mornings began with water. Most meals required water. Most industries used water. Most households stored water. The resource sat quietly at the center of life, which is perhaps why its dangers were often underestimated. Familiarity creates comfort. Comfort can create assumptions, and assumptions sometimes conceal risk. Few medieval people woke each morning fearing their water. They woke expecting to use it, just as modern people expect a tap to function. Yet beneath that expectation existed a fragile system shaped by weather, geography, engineering, labor, and luck. Understanding that fragility helps explain why outbreaks of illness, periods of scarcity, or infrastructure failures could feel so disruptive. The disruption was not merely practical. It challenged confidence. It reminded communities how dependent they truly were. And nowhere would that dependence become more visible than during moments when the ordinary routines of daily water use suddenly broke down, forcing people to confront just how much of their world rested upon sources they could never completely control. And nowhere would that dependence become more visible than during moments when the ordinary routines of daily water use suddenly broke down, forcing people to confront just how much of their world rested upon sources they could never completely control. The breakdown did not always arrive dramatically. Sometimes there was no great flood, no siege, no obvious disaster. Instead, the change emerged slowly enough that people only recognized it after weeks or months had passed. A well that seemed a little lower than usual. A spring that no longer flowed with the same strength. Water that developed an unfamiliar taste. An increase in illness that was difficult to explain. The most unsettling threats were often the quietest. Medieval people lived in a world where warning signs could be ambiguous. A poor harvest announced itself visibly. A fire was impossible to ignore, but water problems frequently developed beneath the surface. This was particularly true in growing towns. As urban populations expanded throughout much of the Middle Ages, many communities gradually discovered that systems which had served their grandparents were no longer sufficient. The change was often incremental. A town of 2,000 people might manage comfortably with a handful of wells and local streams. A town of 6,000 faced different pressures. A town of 15,000 faced different pressures again. Every new household increased demand. Every new workshop consumed resources. Every additional animal contributed waste. The environment did not suddenly become unhealthy overnight. Instead, the margin for error narrowed. And when margins narrow, vulnerabilities become easier to expose. Imagine a public well serving a neighborhood. At first, the arrangement works reasonably well. Residents know one another. The number of users remains manageable. The surrounding environment remains relatively stable. Then the town grows. More houses appear. More people arrive. Economic activity intensifies. The same well now serves far more users than originally intended. Queues become longer. Wear increases. Maintenance becomes more important. The consequences of contamination become greater. Nothing about the well itself has changed. Yet the system surrounding it has transformed completely. This is one reason why medieval urban history and water history are impossible to separate. The growth of cities was not simply an economic story. It was also an environmental story. Every successful city had to solve practical questions about water. Some solved them better than others. And even successful solutions rarely remained sufficient forever. The City of London provides a useful illustration. Over centuries, London's population expanded dramatically. Its economy flourished. Trade increased. Construction accelerated. Wealth accumulated. Yet every sign of prosperity created additional pressure on infrastructure. Authorities repeatedly sought new ways to improve water access. Conduits were constructed. Regulations were issued. Maintenance became a continuing concern. The effort never truly ended because demand never stopped increasing. Similar patterns appeared elsewhere. Medieval Paris struggled with many of the same issues. So did Florence. So did countless smaller towns whose names rarely appear in modern documentaries. Water was a universal challenge because urban success depended upon concentration. And concentration always complicates sanitation. Yet it would be unfair to describe medieval towns solely as places of environmental decline. Many communities genuinely improved their systems over time. This is where the story becomes more interesting than the familiar stereotype. The common image suggests a medieval world trapped in ignorance. The reality reveals a world constantly experimenting. Town governments funded projects. Religious institutions sponsored improvements. Wealthy individuals donated infrastructure. Engineers adapted older ideas and developed new ones. Solutions emerged through experience. Sometimes they worked remarkably well. Consider public fountains supplied by protected conduits. To modern observers, they may appear simple. Yet such installations represented significant organizational achievements. Water had to be captured, transported, protected, distributed, maintained. Each stage required planning. Each stage required labor. Each stage required resources. A functioning fountain represented the visible endpoint of an invisible network. The same principle applies to many aspects of medieval life. We often see the final structure but overlook the system supporting it. Water history encourages us to think in systems. Every bucket drawn from a well connects to geology. Every conduit connects to engineering. Every spring connects to landscape. Every outbreak connects to environment. Nothing exists in isolation. This interconnectedness becomes especially apparent when we examine medieval attitudes toward cleanliness. Modern audiences frequently assume that medieval people cared little about hygiene. The historical reality is considerably more complicated. Expectations differed. Technologies differed. Infrastructure differed. Yet concern for cleanliness appears throughout medieval society. People washed their hands. They cleaned clothing. They bathed when circumstances allowed. Monasteries maintained washing facilities. Urban authorities sometimes regulated sanitation. Medical writers discussed cleanliness. Religious traditions incorporated washing rituals. None of this resembles modern hygiene standards exactly, but neither does it resemble the caricature of a society indifferent to cleanliness. Water played a central role in these practices. The challenge lay in availability rather than interest. Consider bathing. Public bathhouses existed in many medieval towns at various times. Some became popular social spaces. Others acquired mixed reputations depending on region and period. Yet their existence reveals something important. People valued cleanliness enough to support institutions dedicated to it. Bathing was not unknown. It was not universally avoided. It occupied a more complex position than popular myths often suggest. Of course, access varied enormously. Wealth mattered. Geography mattered. Local infrastructure mattered. A resident of a prosperous town with bath facilities experienced water differently from someone living in an isolated rural settlement. This variation is crucial. There was never one medieval experience. There were many. The Middle Ages lasted roughly 1,000 years. They encompassed vast regions. They included different climates, economies, cultures, and political systems. Water practices varied accordingly. Yet despite this diversity, certain patterns appear repeatedly. One of the most persistent is the relationship between water and social status. Wealth could not eliminate risk entirely, but it could often reduce inconvenience. A wealthy household might secure access to better sources. Servants might carry water. Storage facilities might be larger. Infrastructure might be more reliable. Poorer households often possessed fewer options. This does not mean elites lived free from danger. Disease affected all social classes. Contamination respected no title. But resources expanded choices, and choices mattered. If one source appeared questionable, wealthier individuals often had alternatives unavailable to others. This subtle inequality appears throughout water history. It rarely dominates the story, yet it remains present. Water may seem universal, but access rarely is. Even today, the distribution of reliable water often reflects broader social structures. Medieval society was no different. The relationship becomes particularly visible during periods of environmental stress. In years of drought, some communities adapted more easily than others. During floods, certain neighborhoods suffered disproportionately. During outbreaks of illness, crowded districts often faced greater challenges. Water reveals inequalities because everyone depends upon it. The differences emerge in how dependence is managed. Another revealing example comes from travel. Earlier we discussed the difficulties travelers faced when moving through unfamiliar regions. It is worth exploring this world more deeply because medieval mobility was far greater than many people imagine. Merchants crossed long distances. Pilgrims traveled across countries. Students journeyed to universities. Diplomats moved between courts. Soldiers marched. Sailors connected ports. Roads were imperfect. Journeys were demanding. Yet movement remained a fundamental feature of medieval life. Every traveler carried concerns about water, not necessarily because they feared contamination in the modern sense, rather because reliable supply could never be assumed. A familiar source possesses known qualities. An unfamiliar source does not. This uncertainty encouraged practical habits. Travelers sought local advice. They favored established routes. They relied upon inns, monasteries, and communities with known reputations. Information became a form of protection. The same principle governed maritime travel. Life aboard medieval ships introduced unique water challenges. Freshwater storage occupied valuable space. Barrels had limits. Long voyages created difficulties. Water could stagnate. Supplies could diminish. Crew members constantly monitored resources. The sea itself provided no solution. Surrounded by water, sailors depended upon carefully managed reserves. Their experience highlights an important truth. Water availability and water usability are not the same thing. A river may flow nearby. A sea may stretch to the horizon. Yet drinkable water remains precious. Medieval people understood this distinction intimately. They experienced it regularly, which brings us to another fascinating aspect of the story: perception. How did medieval people think about good water? What qualities inspired confidence? What qualities raised suspicion? The answers reveal a world guided by observation. Freshness mattered greatly. Cold water often enjoyed positive reputations. Clear water attracted trust. Running water frequently seemed preferable to stagnant water. Certain springs became famous for particular qualities. Some waters were considered heavy, others light. Some were believed beneficial, others suspicious. Medieval medical writers devoted significant attention to these distinctions. Their theories differed from modern science. Yet many recommendations emerged from genuine attempts to understand environmental influences on health. This effort deserves more respect than it sometimes receives. Historical hindsight makes mistakes appear obvious. But medieval observers worked with the information available. And often they reached surprisingly sensible conclusions. They recognized that not all water was equal. They noticed environmental variation. They connected geography with health. They observed seasonal changes. They attempted classification. These are the actions of people trying to understand their world. The limitations lay not in curiosity but in technology. No microscope existed. No chemical testing existed. No germ theory existed. Invisible dangers remained invisible. Yet observation still provided valuable guidance. This is one reason why local knowledge became so powerful. Communities accumulated generations of experience. Certain wells were trusted. Certain streams were avoided. Certain seasons demanded caution. Such knowledge did not guarantee safety, but it often improved odds. Water history repeatedly reminds us that survival rarely depended upon perfect understanding. Practical success mattered more. and practical success frequently emerged from accumulated experience. This gradual accumulation resembles a form of collective memory. One generation learns something, the next inherits it. Adjustments occur. New observations are added. Over time, communities develop environmental wisdom tailored to local conditions. Much of this knowledge was never written down. It existed in habits, conversations, traditions, daily routines, the path to the spring, the preferred well, the trusted water carrier, the warning about a particular pond after heavy rain. These details rarely appear in official chronicles, yet they shaped life continuously. In many respects, they mattered more than major political events. A king's decision might affect a region eventually. Water decisions affected breakfast tomorrow morning. This perspective helps us appreciate the scale of water's influence. It was not merely a resource among many. It was the foundation supporting countless other activities. Agriculture depended upon it. Industry depended upon it. Travel depended upon it. Religion incorporated it. Medicine relied upon it. Domestic life revolved around it. Even recreation and social interaction often occurred around shared sources. Wells, fountains, streams, and bathhouses functioned as gathering places as much as utilities. People met there, exchanged information, conducted business, shared news. Water shaped social geography. Certain spaces became important because water was present. Remove the water and the social function often disappears as well. This social dimension is easy to overlook because modern infrastructure hides much of the process. We rarely gather around wells. We rarely depend upon public fountains for survival. Medieval communities often did. Water therefore occupied a more visible place in public life. It existed not only inside homes but within communal spaces. This visibility strengthened collective awareness. Everyone understood its importance because everyone interacted with it constantly. Yet familiarity also produced complacency. Just as modern people rarely think about electricity until a power outage occurs, medieval people often stopped noticing water until something disrupted the ordinary routine. A source failed. A drought persisted. Illness spread. Conduit broke. Suddenly attention returned. The invisible foundation became visible again. And when that happened, communities were forced to confront a difficult reality. Their water systems, however ingenious, however familiar, however trusted, remained vulnerable to forces beyond their complete control. The next challenge was not simply obtaining water or transporting it. It was understanding what happened when confidence in a source began to erode, because once people started questioning the safety of a well, a spring, or an entire water supply, the consequences could ripple through every layer of medieval society. The next challenge was not simply obtaining water or transporting it. It was understanding what happened when confidence in a source began to erode, because once people started questioning the safety of a well, a spring, or an entire water supply, the consequences could ripple through every layer of medieval society. And in many ways, that is where the deeper lesson of medieval drinking water ultimately resides. Not in a single contaminated well, not in a particular river, not even in a specific outbreak of illness, but in the fragile relationship between human beings and a resource so essential that it becomes almost invisible when it works properly. Throughout this journey, we have seen that the familiar modern story, that medieval people simply avoided water and drank alcohol instead, fails to capture the reality of everyday life. The truth was more human. People drank water. They depended on water. They worried about water. They engineered systems to transport it. They argued over it. They built communities around it. They invested fortunes in securing it. And sometimes, despite all of those efforts, They still suffered because the dangers hidden within water were often beyond their ability to detect. That reality should not make us view medieval people as naive. If anything, it should encourage the opposite conclusion. Again and again, medieval communities demonstrated practical intelligence. They observed patterns. They protected valuable springs. They regulated wells. They built conduits. They dug astonishingly deep shafts through rock. They maintained drainage systems. They experimented with storage methods. They adapted to droughts, floods, population growth, and changing conditions. They did all of this without the scientific tools that modern societies take for granted. The story of medieval water is therefore not merely a story about risk. It is also a story about adaptation, about persistence, about people trying to solve problems using the knowledge available to them. And perhaps that is why the subject remains surprisingly relatable. The medieval world often feels distant when we think about kings, crusades, castles, and ancient laws. Yet water brings us closer. Everyone understands thirst. Everyone understands the comfort of a reliable source. Everyone understands the anxiety created by uncertainty. Across centuries, those feelings remain remarkably familiar. A peasant carrying buckets from a village spring, a monk inspecting a monastery conduit, a merchant stopping at an unfamiliar well, and a modern person filling a glass from the kitchen tap are separated by vast differences in technology and knowledge. Yet all depend upon the same fundamental resource. What changes is not the importance of water. What changes is the system surrounding it. In many parts of the modern world, those systems have become so effective that their success is almost invisible. Water arrives through pipes. It is filtered, tested, monitored, treated, protected by networks of infrastructure that stretch far beyond what most people ever see. The achievement is extraordinary, yet it can also create a subtle illusion that safe water is normal, inevitable, or automatic. The medieval experience reminds us that it is none of those things. Safe water is a human accomplishment, one built slowly over centuries, one maintained through continual effort, one that can never be entirely separated from geography, climate, engineering, politics, economics, and public trust. In that sense, the story of medieval drinking water is not only about the past. It is also about understanding the foundations of the present. The wells, springs, conduits, cisterns, mills, channels, and rivers of the Middle Ages belong to a world with different knowledge, different technologies, and different risks. But they confronted a challenge that remains familiar. How do you provide a community with something absolutely essential when nature is unpredictable and perfect control is impossible? Every generation has answered that question differently. The medieval answer was shaped by observation, labor, local knowledge, religious institutions, practical engineering, and communal responsibility. It was imperfect, sometimes dangerously imperfect. Yet it sustained societies for centuries. And perhaps the most remarkable thing is that most medieval people did not spend their lives thinking constantly about water. Just as we do today, they fetched it, used it, complained about it when necessary, and carried on with the countless other concerns of daily life. The baker worried about bread. The farmer worried about weather. The merchant worried about trade. The parent worried about children. The monk worried about prayer. The ruler worried about power. Water quietly sat beneath all of those concerns, supporting them, invisible when sufficient, unavoidable when threatened. That quiet presence may be the most historically important part of the story, because the greatest forces in human history are not always the loudest. Sometimes they are the ones people depend upon every day without thinking about them very much at all. A river flowing beyond a town wall, a spring emerging from a hillside, a bucket lowered into darkness. a cup raised to thirsty lips. For medieval people, each of those ordinary moments carried risks they could not fully see, yet they also carried something else. Trust. Trust in local knowledge. Trust in familiar routines. Trust in systems built by previous generations. Trust that tomorrow's water would still be there. Sometimes that trust was rewarded. Sometimes it was not. But it shaped medieval life just as surely as kings, wars, and cathedrals did. And when we look closely enough, we discover that the history of water is really the history of everyday survival, the countless unseen decisions that allowed entire societies to endure. So the next time you fill a glass, spare a moment for the people of the medieval world, for the villagers walking to the well before sunrise, for the water carriers crossing crowded streets, for the monks maintaining channels stone by stone, for the engineers digging impossibly deep shafts in search of reliable groundwater, for the families judging a spring by taste, clarity, memory, and hope. Their world was riskier than ours in ways they could scarcely understand. Yet it was also shaped by ingenuity, resilience, and a constant effort to make life workable despite uncertainty. And in that quiet struggle, carried out bucket by bucket across centuries, we find a surprisingly human story, one that flows through the Middle Ages from beginning to end, just as water itself flowed through every village, every town, every monastery, every castle, and every life touched by it. Thank you for spending this time exploring the hidden world behind something as ordinary and as essential as a drink of water.